The Montana Territory, in the blistering heat of August 1888, was a land that tolerated no weakness. It tested resolve with wind, dust, and a horizon so vast it could swallow a soul whole. The world did not end with a bang or a whisper, but with the violent percussive crack of splintering timber. One moment, the stagecoach was a lumbering beast, groaning along a track carved into the unforgiving earth. The next, a front wheel disintegrated, sending the entire conveyance plunging into a gully with a sickening lurch. Dust, thick and ochre, erupted in a choking cloud. The horses, tangled in their harnesses, screamed with a sound of pure terror. Elara Vance was thrown from the wreckage, a strangled cry torn from her throat as she landed with brutal force on her knees, the impact jarring every bone in her body. For a long moment, she simply knelt there, the world a dizzying smear of brown and blue. Then, a cold, familiar fury washed through her, clearing her head. She pushed herself to her feet, her chest heaving not from fear, but from a deep, settled anger at a world that seemed determined to break her. At 25, she was tall and willowy, a frame that belied the rigid strength in her spine. A stubborn jaw was set firm beneath high cheekbones, and her dark auburn hair, a fiery cascade she usually battled into submission, was escaping its pins in wild tendrils. Her traveling dress was ruined, her palms scraped raw and bleeding, but her startlingly green eyes remained defiantly dry. She had exhausted her supply of tears years ago, leaving only a hard, glittering resolve in their place. The driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of harsh sun and cheap whiskey, was shouting curses as he struggled to calm the panicked horses. Inside the tilted coach, the other passengers, two elderly sisters clutching their reticules and a silent, sweat-stained salesman from Denver, were whimpering. Elara ignored them all, her gaze sweeping the landscape. It offered no comfort, nothing but an endless sea of rolling hills, bleached grass that crackled under the oppressive sun, and the mocking emptiness of the sky. A knot of pure, cold dread tightened in her stomach. She had sold the last of her mother's jewelry, packed her life into a single worn bag, and gambled everything on this journey to the town of Stone Creek. Now, stranded and alone, it seemed the house had won yet again. "Are you all right, ma'am?" The voice came from behind her, deep and calm, a solid anchor in the swirling chaos. She spun, her right hand dropping instinctively toward the worn leather of her boot, where a small, wickedly sharp knife was nestled. The habit was so ingrained she no longer thought about it. The man standing there, however, did not seem to be a source of trouble. He was the land personified, rugged, quiet, and enduring. He held a rifle in the crook of one arm with a casual ease that spoke of long familiarity. A sweat-stained hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that had been carved and darkened by the elements. He looked to be in his mid-30s, his shoulders broad beneath a simple homespun shirt. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a stormy sky, gray and deep, and they regarded her with a steady, unreadable calm. He was a lonely rancher, a man who seemed to have grown from the very soil he stood upon, solid and immovable. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice clipped and harsher than she intended. She turned away, making a useless show of brushing the thick dust from her skirt. "You from Stone Creek?" He didn't move, his presence a quiet weight at her back. He gave a single economical nod. "The name's Silas Cole. I was checking my northern fence line. Saw the wheel go." His gaze shifted to the wrecked coach, his assessment swift and final. "That driver isn't fixing that without a proper workshop and a week's time." "I had already surmised that," Elara snapped, crossing her arms over her chest, a fragile shield against her own rising panic. The barest hint of a smile touched the corner of Silas's mouth, a fleeting change in the rugged landscape of his face. "You were headed somewhere specific, I take it." "I have a position waiting for me. At the boarding house," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Now, it appears my immediate future involves a very long walk." "You won't make it before nightfall," he stated, not as a suggestion, but as an indisputable fact. "And this isn't the kind of country you want to be caught in after dark. "Coyotes are the least of your worries." "I've slept in worse places," she retorted, the lie sharp and automatic. Silas tilted his head, his gray eyes seeming to see straight through her bravado. "That may be. Still, it's better to ride. My horse is sturdy. He can carry two." Ilara hesitated. Every painful lesson she had learned screamed at her to refuse, to rely on no one, especially not a strange man in the middle of nowhere. Men offered help, but there was always a price, a debt to be collected later. Yet, something in his quiet demeanor, in the patient way he stood waiting for her answer without a hint of pressure, made her reconsider. He was not looking at her with avarice or pity, but with a simple, straightforward assessment of her predicament. The alternative was to remain here, at the mercy of the elements and whatever else the night might bring. "Fine," she said at last, her voice tight. "But I should warn you, I carry a knife." He stepped back, giving her a clear path. "Good," he said, his tone even. "It means you're smart." The silence of the ride was as vast as the land around them. The only sounds were the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves on the hard-packed earth and the whisper of the wind through the dry grass. The sun began its slow, majestic descent, bleeding colors of fire and gold across the western sky. Ilara sat stiffly behind Silas, her knuckles white where she gripped the saddle horn, her other hand protectively clutching her bag. The heat of his back radiated through her thin dress, a disconcerting point of contact in her carefully guarded world. "You have family in Stone Creek?" Silas asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to travel right through her. "No," she answered, the single word holding a universe of loss. "Not anymore." He glanced back over his shoulder, a brief, searching look, but he didn't pry further. She was intensely grateful for the unspoken courtesy. After a few more minutes of the rhythmic gait, she felt an inexplicable need to clarify her position, to draw a line in the dust. "I'm not looking for a savior, if that's what you're thinking." "I wasn't thinking anything of the sort," he replied, his voice still even, unperturbed. "You were stranded. You needed a ride. That's all there is to it." She found herself studying the back of his neck, the way his dark hair curled just over his collar, the solid set of his shoulders. He seemed so self-contained, a man who needed nothing from the world. "You live alone?" she asked, the question surprising her. "I do," he confirmed. "Have a small ranch a few miles from town, a few head of cattle. It's a quiet life. I had a place once," she heard herself say, the words slipping out before she could stop them, drawn out by the hypnotic rhythm of the ride and the deepening twilight. "With a man. He took my savings, everything my father had left me, and disappeared. Left me with nothing but his debts and the scorn of the town." Silas didn't turn around, but she saw the muscles in his shoulders tense slightly. "That happened back east," he stated, his tone leaving no room for doubt. It was a statement, not a question. He nodded, a small, barely perceptible movement, as if he understood far more than she had said. Just as the last vestiges of light were devoured by the horizon, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavy, charged with an electric tension. A storm was rolling in off the mountains, a dark, bruised mass of clouds that swallowed the stars. A brilliant fork of lightning split the sky, followed moments later by a deep, guttural rumble of thunder. Silas cursed under his breath, a low, frustrated sound. "We won't make it to town before this hits. My cabin is closer. We'll have to take shelter there." Ilara's entire body went rigid. The thought of being enclosed in a small space with this stranger sent a fresh wave of alarm through her. But as if on cue, the first cold, heavy drops of rain began to fall, striking her face like thrown pebbles. She looked at the roiling black sky, then at the vast, featureless darkness around them. She had no other choice. She gave a single, sharp nod. They reached his ranch just as the deluge began in earnest. The cabin was a small, rugged structure of rough-hewn timber, looking as though it had been hewn from the landscape itself. A thin, determined curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, a beacon of warmth in the storm. Silas swung down from the horse with fluid grace, tied the reins to a post, and then turned to help her. His hands were calloused and strong as they circled her waist to lift her down. For a moment, she was suspended, her face level with his, and in the flash of another lightning strike, she saw the rain dripping from the brim of his hat, the unreadable expression in his gray eyes. He released her as soon as her feet were on the ground. The cabin door creaked open, and she stepped inside, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the dim, flickering lamplight. The interior was Spartan, but immaculately clean. A single wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. A wood-burning stove radiated a welcome heat, and in the far corner there was one neatly made bed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. "I'll sleep on the floor," he said immediately, his voice quiet as he closed the door behind them, shutting out the roar of the storm. He had read her thoughts as easily as if they were printed in a book. Elara said nothing. She walked to the stove, extending her numb, trembling hands toward the warmth. Silas moved with a quiet efficiency, hanging his rifle on a wooden peg and then retrieving supplies from a cupboard. There wasn't much: a sack of beans, a slab of dried meat, a tin of coffee. He prepared a simple meal without a word, the only sounds the scrape of a knife against a wooden board and the hiss of the rain against the window panes. He handed her a tin plate and a fork, and they ate in a thick, charged silence, seated on opposite sides of the small room as the thunder rattled the very foundations of the cabin. "Have you ever been married?" she asked, the question thrown like a stone into the quiet pool of the room. He looked up from his plate, shaking his head. "Came close once, a long time ago. It wasn't the right time. After that, I suppose I stopped looking." She watched him for a long moment, his face cast in shadow and light from the single lantern. It was a face that gave nothing away. "I'm not a virgin," she said suddenly, her voice flat and hard. It was a test, a shield, a desperate attempt to lay all her damaged cards on the table at once. Let him judge her. Let him recoil. It was better to know now. Silas looked up slowly, his movements deliberate. He set his plate down on the floor beside his chair. His gaze met hers across the small room, and it was utterly devoid of the shock or condemnation she had expected. It was just steady. "I never asked you to be," he said, his voice quiet but resonant in the small space. She stared at him, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the subtle shift in his expression, the tightening of his jaw. There was nothing. "I just thought you should know," she murmured, the hardness in her voice dissolving into a bewildering softness. He nodded once. "You didn't owe me that explanation, Elara, but thank you for it." The silence that followed was different. The tension had eased, replaced by a fragile, uncertain calm. "You don't talk much, do you?" she asked, needing to fill the space. "Only when it matters," he replied. She stood and walked to the single window, tracing a line through the condensation on the cool glass. The rain-streaked pane reflected a distorted image of herself, a stranger with haunted eyes. Her shoulders, which she always held ramrod straight, slumped just a little. "I don't expect anything from you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm just trying to start over. I just want to be left alone to do it." Silas rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate. He came to stand beside her, his presence a warm, solid thing in the small, storm-tossed cabin. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat of him, the sheer physical reality of him. "Then start here," he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "You're safe." Elara turned to face him, her green eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She blinked them back fiercely. "I don't want to be saved." "I'm not offering to," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I'm just offering you a safe place to rest for the night." She held his gaze for a long, breathless moment, searching for any hint of deception, any flicker of falsehood. She found none. There was only a profound, unshakable stillness. Finally, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "All right," They stood there in the quiet heart of the storm, two strangers who had been shipwrecked by life in different ways. Outside, the thunder rolled on, a distant, angry god. But inside the small, warm cabin, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Ilara did not feel entirely alone. The world that greeted her the next morning was newborn, washed clean by the storm. A heavy mist clung to the low-lying areas, and the air was thick with the rich, clean scent of wet sage and damp earth. Ilara stepped onto the porch, the cool, rough planks a grounding sensation beneath her bare feet. The relentless sun was still hidden, the sky a soft, pearlescent gray. Inside, Silas was already moving about. The smell of brewing coffee filled the small space. "It's almost ready," he said, his back to her as he sliced a thick piece of cornbread from a loaf wrapped in cloth. She sat at the table, her hands folded in her lap. In the gentle morning light, the hard lines around her eyes and mouth seemed to have softened. "I need to get to the boarding house today," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Mrs. Albright will be expecting me." "You know her?" she asked, surprised. "She's a hard woman," Silas said, pouring the steaming coffee into 2 tin mugs. "But she's fair. She helped me when I first settled here, sold me this parcel of land for less than it was worth. People mistake her silence for unkindness, but she just has no patience for fools or liars." He set a mug in front of her, and she wrapped her cold hands around its warmth. "What about your plans?" he asked, leaning against the counter. "Beyond this job." She stared into the rising steam, a miniature storm in her cup. "I'm tired of plans," she confessed. "Plans have a way of falling apart. I just want to earn my own keep, eat food I've paid for with my own labor, and sleep at night without one eye open, waiting for the next disaster." "That's a fair goal," he said, his expression thoughtful. They ate the cornbread in a comfortable silence, a quiet understanding passing between them that needed no words. When she stood to get her things, he offered to take her into town. She started to refuse, the old habit of fierce independence dying hard, but he simply said, "You could walk. But you don't have to." This time, she relented with a nod. As he saddled the horse, she leaned against the fence rail, watching him. He moved with an unhurried patience, a kind of economy of motion that spoke of competence, not laziness. He checked the cinch twice, ran a soothing hand down the horse's neck, and murmured something too low for her to hear. When he reached down a hand to help her up, she took it without flinching. "Have you always been alone out here?" she asked, once they were on their way, the trail into town muddy but passable. "I had a younger brother, Samuel," he said, his voice taking on a different timbre. This was all his dream. He died of a fever on a cattle drive to Kansas. It took him fast. This land was legally his. I was just supposed to sell it, settle his affairs, and go back east." "Why didn't you?" she asked softly. He was quiet for a long time, the horse's hooves making a soft, sucking sound in the mud. "It felt wrong," he finally said, "like I'd be leaving something unfinished, like I'd be abandoning him all over again." Stone Creek was a modest town, a single main street carved from the wilderness. When they arrived, the sun had broken through the clouds, and steam was rising from the damp earth. The boarding house was a 2-story clapboard building, its paint peeling, but its porch swept clean. Silas stayed on the horse as she dismounted, his gaze steady on her. "Are you sure you don't want to come in?" she asked, feeling an odd reluctance to see him go. He shook his head. "This part is yours to do." She took a step closer to the horse, looking up at him. "You always stand back like that? Let people sort out their own troubles?" "Only when I'm sure they're strong enough to do it," he answered, his gray eyes holding hers. She understood. He was giving her the space to prove herself, to herself. She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "I'll see you around, if you want to," he said, his tone carefully neutral, leaving the choice entirely up to her. She turned and walked up the porch steps without looking back, but when she reached the door, her hand on the knob, She paused. "Thank you, Silas," she said, her voice clear in the morning air. He simply touched the brim of his hat. "You're welcome, Ilara." He waited until the door had closed firmly behind her before he turned his horse and began the slow ride back to his solitary ranch. Inside, Ilara stood before Mrs. Albright, a stern, gray-haired woman whose gaze was as sharp and penetrating as a hawk's. She answered the woman's rapid-fire questions plainly and honestly, without embellishment or excuse. When Mrs. Albright finally pointed to a mountain of soiled linens and said, "You'll start there," Ilara nodded and picked up the heavy basket without a single word of complaint. That evening, as she soaked her aching muscles in a hot bath, she looked out the small window of her attic room toward the dark line of the distant hills. Somewhere out there, in a small, rough-hewn cabin, was a quiet man who had seen her at her worst and had asked for nothing in return. For the first time in a very long time, a fragile, unfamiliar seed of hope began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. The weeks that followed were a blur of relentless, back-breaking work. Ilara scrubbed floors until her knees were raw, washed and ironed mountains of laundry until her arms ached, and served meals to the boarders with a quiet efficiency that earned her grudging respect from Mrs. Albright. She spoke little, kept to herself, and slowly, painstakingly, began to rebuild her life from the ground up. On her one afternoon off each week, she would walk west, leaving the small confines of the town behind and heading toward the open land. It was on one of these walks, nearly a month after her arrival, that she saw him again. He was standing outside the blacksmith's shop, a coil of rope slung over one shoulder, his hat pulled low. She watched him for a long moment from across the dusty street, a strange fluttering in her chest. When he finally looked up and saw her, he didn't smile, but he tipped his hat in acknowledgement. "You look well," he said as she crossed to meet him. "I'm working," she replied, as if that explained everything. "It suits you," he observed. "I came out your way last week," he said, his gaze direct. "I didn't see you." "I left a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth on your fence post," she confessed, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "I found it," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "It was good. I came to town today to see if you'd walk with me." "I'm not looking for a rescue," she reminded him, the words a familiar refrain. "And I'm not offering one," he countered, his voice steady. They walked to the edge of town, to a rail fence that overlooked a wide pasture. The noise of the town faded behind them, replaced by the hum of insects and the sigh of the wind. "I used to think that starting over meant pretending the past never happened," she said, her voice soft. "Like I could just wash myself clean of it all. But you can't. The stains remain." "Maybe starting over isn't about erasing the past," he suggested, his gaze on the horizon. "Maybe it's just about learning how to carry it better." "I don't need you to be new, Ilara," he said, turning to her. "I just need you to be you." She met his gaze, her heart pounding. "I need you to know something, Silas. If you take my hand, I am not just looking for company to pass the time. I have been touched by men who didn't see me. They saw something they wanted to take, and they left marks that you can't see, but that last longer than any bruise. I see you, Ilara," he said, his voice low and certain, and in that moment she knew it was the truest thing anyone had ever said to her. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out her hand. He took it, his calloused fingers closing around hers, not gently, as if she were something fragile, but firmly, as if she were something real and precious. "I have to mend a section of fence tomorrow, up on the North Ridge," he said after a long, comfortable silence. "It's slow, hard work, but the view is good." "I'll bring the bread," she said, her voice steady. The next day they worked together under the vast Montana sky, the rhythmic sound of the hammer a kind of communication all its own. They shared her bread and his water, and as they rested he pulled a small worn tin from his pocket. Inside was a folded piece of paper. It was the list his brother, Samuel, had written all those years ago. Buy land. Build a house with windows that open. Don't die alone. As he read the words aloud, his voice thick with emotion, Ilara understood the true depth of his solitude, the quiet burden of legacy he carried. "I won't forget you, Ilara," he said, his gray eyes searching her face. "Not ever." As they rode back to town in the fading light, she rested her head against his strong back, a sense of peace settling over her like a warm blanket. At the boarding house gate, she hesitated. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "This trusting." "You don't need to know how," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You just have to want to." "I want to," she breathed. He turned in the saddle, his hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Then stay," he said simply. "Not tonight," she whispered, "but soon." The first frost came early that year, silvering the dead grass and painting the windows of the boarding house with intricate, feathery patterns. Ilara left before sunrise, a covered basket in one hand and a folded flannel shirt in the other. When she reached the cabin, Silas was already outside, checking the fence of a small pen. He stood as she approached, a question in his eyes. "It was my father's," she said, holding out the shirt. "I'd like you to have it." He took it with a reverence that touched her deeply. They ate the stew she had brought in the quiet warmth of the cabin. Afterwards, he led her outside, to a clearing she hadn't noticed before. Under a canvas tarp was a neat stack of milled lumber. "I started cutting these last winter," he said, his voice quiet. "I wasn't sure what for at the time. I was thinking of adding a room to the cabin, a room with a big window that faces the sunrise." He turned to her, his heart in his eyes. "I don't want you to keep walking back to town, Ilara. I want you to stay, if you want that too." She looked from the stack of wood, a tangible symbol of his hope, to his earnest, waiting face. "I want a life with my hands in the soil," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I want to wake up and know that the day is mine to shape. I want to belong somewhere again." "You belong here," he said simply, "with me." "Then build it," she whispered, "and I'll help you." They were married a week later in the back room of the Mercantile with Mrs. Albright as their witness. Her wedding gift was a rare, hard hug that left Ilara breathless. That evening they rode home together, not to a cabin, but to their home. The years that followed were etched into the land and into their faces. The cabin grew, room by room. A garden flourished under Ilara's patient hands. A son was born, a quiet boy with his father's stormy gray eyes. 2 years later, a daughter followed, a fiery spirit with her mother's auburn hair and insatiable curiosity. Life was not easy. There were harsh winters, summer droughts, and the constant demanding work of the ranch. But through it all, they were a team, their love a quiet, steady flame in the hearth of their home. They spoke less than most couples, for they had learned to communicate in the silent language of shared lives, in the way he laid her boots by the fire to warm on a cold morning, in the way she knew just how he liked his coffee, in the simple, profound comfort of a shared glance across a dinner table. One crisp autumn afternoon, years later, Ilara stood on the porch, watching Silas teach their son how to mend a fence, the same way he had once taught her. Their daughter was at her side, braiding blades of grass together. She looked out at the rolling hills, at the vast open land that had once seemed so terrifying and empty. Now it was the landscape of her life, a life she had built not from the ashes of her past, but from its hard-won lessons. She had come to this place with nothing, a lone woman with a guarded heart and a hidden knife. Now her hands were full, and her heart was home. The lonely rancher was no longer lonely, and the woman who had refused to be saved had, in the end, saved them both.